So I assume all of you have a program, but just in case. Yao Yang, who you already know, sitting to my left here. Dr. Nick Lardy, Peterson Institute of International Economics. Dr. Catherine Mann is the Chief Global Economist here at Citi. Professor Feng from PKU as well. And Xiao Zhang, professor at PKU as well, School of International Studies. It's a real honor to be here. And let's get right into it. So the title of this panel is, question mark, a possible agreement between China and the U.S. to end the trade war. So let me ask a two-pronged question. There's, what would you like to happen? What do you think will happen? With the understanding that I know a lot of, I assume everyone on this panel is connected in some way to the various chattering class of their governments and have some insight as to what may or may not be happening as we see these talks that are going on right now. Yao Yang, let me start with you. Do you think that there is a possible agreement? And what would you like it to look like, or do you think it might look like?
Okay, thank you, Michelle. I think there is a high possibility for the two countries to reach agreement. Actually, before this Beijing talk, I was quite pessimistic about the agreement. But after this one, I have become more optimistic because the two countries can sit down and talk about some detailed issues or details of a agreement, possible agreement, right? So if you ask me what kind of agreement the two countries should have, I would divide the issues into two groups. One is what I can call unfair practice. That is, if one country's practice hurts the other country beyond its own border, then that's unfair. So in that case, we should have imminent correction. Okay? So what do I mean by hurting the other side beyond the border? If in a connected world, right, every domestic policy has some influence on other countries, particularly when we think about the United States and China. What the U.S. does has a tremendous international ramification. The same is true for China, but probably to a lesser extent. Right? So if we want to include everything in the talk, then that's impossible. Right? Which means we are going to discuss every possible institution and policy in the other country. So we have to focus. Right? This one, the unfair practice means just you hurt the other country beyond your own border. Let me give you some example. IPR protection, right? And so if China or US does not protect IPR, that's going to hurt the other country. High tariffs, subsidies to acquisition and merger, and some kind of mercantilist trade policy, like a subsidy to export and the restriction on imports. I think those belong to the first category that requires imminent correction. Okay. So the second category includes those behind border policies. I think we have to be careful on that one. So the United States proposed reciprocity as the main principle for the talk. Behind this principle is the assumption that the two countries share the same policy preference. I think that's hard. Right? Even between the United States and the EU, you cannot make that assumption. Let alone China and the United States. China's per capita income is only 1/5 of American level. China is still a transition country in many sense. So in that case, probably we should give China more room for gradual reform, like Dr. Qin Zhao just said. So that can include SOE policy subsidies to innovation, and some of the market access issues. Right? I'm not saying that we should not put those items on the table. What I want to say is that those are not something that need imminent correction. Those are the items that can be put on the table for negotiation.
Provocative thoughts there. Dr. Lardy, do you think there's going to be a deal? What's it going to look like? What would you like it to look like?
Well, I'm an optimist, so I think obviously eventually there will be a deal. I think both sides have a very strong interest in coming to an agreement. The Chinese economy is slowing for a number of structural reasons, which an agreement could address. I think in the U.S. we will see increasingly the evidence that tariffs are actually disadvantaging the U.S. economy, reducing employment, slowing growth. This has been somewhat obscured by the effects of the very large tax cut that we had in 2018, but I think as the effects of that begin to wear off, we'll see that the tariffs have a negative effect. Not just the tariffs with China, but other tariffs that we have imposed, particularly steel and aluminum, and the threat of tariffs against European cars and so forth. So if economic rationality prevails, which I don't think we can count on, at least on the U.S. side, I think there should be an agreement. Sooner is better. I don't know exactly when it will happen. What will it look like? Well, I think China has already done quite a bit. It's not been very well noticed in the United States. But this year so far, last year so far, China cut its tariffs unilaterally by 25%. They've taken additional steps to cut tariffs on about 700 lines in their tariff schedule starting January 1st this year. They have lifted ownership caps for foreign companies. This is very obvious in financial services, but it's also happened in automobiles. Foreign automobile producers can now have a wholly foreign-owned firm in China, which has not been possible in earlier years. They've reduced the negative list, which restricts which identifies the areas that foreign firms can't invest in. And they have taken some significant steps to improve protection of intellectual property. So these things have dribbled out bit by bit. They have not gotten the attention that I believe they should have, but I think they will ultimately be part of the overall settlement between the two sides. I would also like to see progress on what some people refer to, I think correctly, as structural reforms. Yao Yang just mentioned the whole question of subsidies to state-owned enterprises. A little bit more than 40% of all Chinese companies are losing money even after they receive some direct subsidies, but they're kept afloat through increased access to bank credit. And this distorts the domestic market, and I think also has some adverse effects on global markets. So that would be one example of an additional structural reform that I hope would be addressed. I don't think these subsidies can be eliminated overnight, but over some period of time, I think China should commit to reduce these subsidies to make the domestic market more market-oriented, which I think would reduce trade frictions with the United States and also other countries.
So when Professor Yao highlights, okay, let's get to the unfair practices and deal with those immediately, and he listed them, but then the other stuff that we broadly, the U.S. business community broadly says, reciprocity, you Chinese companies can invest, up until recently, almost whatever you wanted to do here, we cannot do the same there. You have subsidies. He seemed to advocate a slower approach because of China's still low per capita GDP. Would you advocate a slow approach to undoing that role in of the state intervention into the economy?
Well, I think as a practical matter, it can't be done overnight. So the question is, can it be done in a matter of quarters, or is it a matter of years? And I think you'd probably have to take each one of these distortions and see what's feasible, see what can be done. I think in some areas you could move fairly quickly. In other areas there'll be constraints.
Dr. Mann, what do you think? We're going to get a deal? What's it going to look like? What are you hearing? Anything good?
So I think it's important to put this trade.
Put that mic closer to you.
Okay, I think it's important to put this trade discussion in a more macroeconomic context, because it's not a trade war that is happening against a backdrop of a global economy that is synchronized upturn, shall we say. So the issue here is that China was slowing well before the trade war started to heat up. And so I think we have to be cautious to suggest that if we could get a trade deal in place, that China would necessarily solve all of its macroeconomic problems, and to sort of assume that a trade deal would yield that improvement in macroeconomic conditions in China is a bridge too far. So I think that's an important issue to put into place, because it means that if a trade deal is reached and there is not an improvement in the overall macroeconomic conditions in China, then what kind of outcome might be, how stable would any trade agreement be if in fact things don't start to improve? So I think that's one issue. Now, of course, on the U.S. side, it's also a case where even though U.S. growth looks very good right now, the trajectory is for substantial slowing. We had a lot of volatility in financial markets most recently, which many people argue is a consequence of the Twitter trade war, or trade war by Twitter, and that if a trade deal were to be solved or to be resolved, that too would lead to a more stable macroeconomic profile and climate for the United States. Once again, if a trade deal is reached and yet there still seems to be some slowing in the U.S. economy, some continued turbulence in financial markets, then again, will both parties sort of say, well, we tried that trade thing, we thought we agreed to something, and yet it hasn't really improved our macroeconomic climate. So as I say, I think it's important not to put inordinate weight on trade being the only reason for why China is slowing on the one hand, and for why U.S. Financial turbulence on the other hand are things that we observe. So that's the first point. The second point is on trade itself and what kind of issues might be at the fore for U.S. trade. So the first issue is that if we look at what has been on offer most recently, the most recent information about what's on offer, it does very much look like the agreement that China thought that they had in place in May. Buy more ag, buy more energy, change some of the ownership requirements, et cetera, tariffs, which as Nick noted, have already been put into place. And of course, the U.S. backed away from that completely. And so what's on offer looks exactly like something that they have done, had put out before. And the question is, why would the U.S. agree now when it didn't look so great to agree with it in May? People will say, well, it's because of financial turbulence. Well, if financial turbulence sort of moderates, then maybe we will go back to what's on offer right now is not good enough. Now, related to that, I would call that a veneer trade agreement. It's a veneer. It solves some of the most obvious issues, which is the bilateral trade deficit, but it doesn't solve any of the real issues, which have underlying issues coming from the structure of the economy, and in both cases, in both the Chinese case and the U.S. case. So it doesn't solve anything, and therefore is not going to be stable. So the other factor, of course, is that a veneer agreement of this nature doesn't address at all any of the national security issues. And what has certainly been the case over the course of the summer and into the fall, into where we are now, is the strengthening power and power of the national security hawks within the U.S. overall administration. And a veneer agreement doesn't resolve any of those challenges. And now it might be that a veneer agreement is reached to sort of calm the waters initially, but that just gives an opportunity for the national security hawks to return to prominence at whatever time might be viewed as relevant or necessary for some future issue in the U.S. So I think that is, you know, an element of this. Again, we cannot kind of separate the trade war from national security. We can't separate the trade war from macroeconomics. And if I say one thing about the national security, there are many different elements of it. I obviously can't talk about all of them. I'm not an expert at all. But the one place where it really comes down and the unique area where we can discuss it is the 5G platform and how it pertains to Huawei and the situation with the CEO Mann in Canada.
Great outline, thank you. Professor Lu Feng,
Yes.
what do you think?
Yeah.
A deal?
Thank you, Michelle. I think this year is likely, you know, there's a more negotiation and there's a progress and eventually deals, you know. But not only in bilateral negotiation between China and the United States, but also multilateral, you know, and negotiation under the head of the so-called WTO reform. Okay, I think why we can say that, and there's several reasons. Number one, you look from the United States perspectives. First, economy in this country facing, you know, downward adjustment pressures, you know, and nobody want some external sort of the negative impact from the further escalating of the trade war. Second, you will see, look at the data of United States trade between United States and China. You can see, of course, the data by day of the November, you can see actually the surplus from China, bilateral surplus from China vis-a-vis United States actually increased rather than declined. That indicates actually trade war tariff measures is not working. It's not addressing the imbalances between these two countries, you know, in any significant extent. Number three, I think, maybe, I guess, personal observation, United States government launched tariff war and trade war. They also understand using this kind of means will not achieve their goal, but they can draw attention of China, you know, to the concerns of the United States, even, you know, by the world scale. So I think that this objective, to some extent, has been achieved already. So in other words, if you compare the situation now with what happened last year when we were in New York, the totally different, you know, and environment. So these 3 points of consideration, I think the United States government also in the position to which take a deal, to make a deal, you know, through negotiation. For China's aspects, it's clearly, you know, Chinese government always says they want to negotiate to address the concerns of both sides. Okay, so that is the consistent position. Number two, of course, as mentioned by other panelists, you know, and the China economy also facing downward pressure, you know, even more serious than we expected, for example, half a year ago. So I think both sides, on the other hand, two countries are largest economy in the world. So they realize, you know, and if they're not reverse escalation of the trade war evolved, you know, in the certain period of last year, you know, it will be not good for the global world. So this is why I think it will have reasonable, you know, sort of the optimism about the deal. But finally, final point I want to make is some issues maybe effectively can be taken care or addressed on the bilateral talks between China and the United States. But some other issues, more deeply concerned with the core institutional arrangements in China may not be able to be solved through bilateral talks. Maybe we need WTO reform and that kind of multilateral negotiation to address, not only for China, but also for states. Because states, United States government in recent years, and they boycott the appointment of appeal judge in WTO, make WTO facing the real risk of the paralysis. So I think on the other hand, I think not only China, but a lot of other countries worries, how can we define a reasonable relationships between domestic trade law versus multilateral rules. Not only China worry about that, but other countries, including maybe United States allies, worry about that. I think these issues also need to be addressed on WTO reform. So in summary, I think if you're looking ahead this year, I think that key words, catchwords in the international economic diplomacy or relationship would be talk rather than war in last year. Thank you.
Professor Xiao Zhang, what do you think?
Well, I'm a political scientist by training. I'm not an economist, much less a finance person. Political scientists are better at explaining history. What's happening between China and the United States today is very much similar to what happened between the United States and Japan back in the 80s. If you look in the technology sector, some of you may recall there was the Toshiba Kongsberg scandal. We're very much similar to what's going on today with the ZTE and the Huawei issue. Many in China are quite slow to capture the sentiment here in the United States. Most, I would say, still don't understand how here in the US there is this belief that China, however you define it, is a factor behind this populism in recent years, especially in the presidential elections. And many of you, of course, don't understand what indeed may be Chinese discussions or reservations about the establishment of such institutions as the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So what I'm trying to say is that, like Catherine was saying, exactly what led to the trade dispute, there's a lot of thinking to be done on both sides. But I see it, the most damaging part of the negotiations between the two countries at this point of time, being a political scientist by training, is that this Cold War idea, this new Cold War idea, this demand for third country markets to choose between China and the United States, as if these equipments cannot be independently, let's say, tested in terms of the hardcore technology. So it's going in the wrong direction. It's moving way beyond jobs. It's almost emotion driven. It's almost hatred, because this glass, it can be used to feed meat. It can also put poison and kill someone else. But at the end of the day, I cannot really force. You can have many options, and what's now on the table, one option is to tell some countries, in order to demonstrate loyalty or what else, buy these, not buy those. That's very bad. So I think the two countries need to be, we need to think this straight. There's a lot of anger going around, but that's the wrong direction. Point one. Point two, in addition to what Feng said about the WTO, look, here in the US, you say China in the WTO was a cause of misery in some part of the United States. If you recall, the Seattle round of the WTO negotiations, 1999, that failed to materialize, that was even before China joined the WTO. The United States as an institution, had reservations about the WTO right back then.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but to tell people there were massive protests in Seattle. They were incredibly dramatic. It was the first sign of a real anti-trade position here in the United States.
Exactly. So what I'm trying to say is that we probably need to re-educate ourselves a little bit. The last point is that I try to bring myself to the last point list. It's in China's self-interest, among many other things, to end this requirement for joint ventures with American or other foreign companies. And that's been done. We are revising our foreign investment law, where we used to have a law for joint ventures, a law for other types of categories of foreign investment. Now it's all simplified into one. We need to shorten the negative list. That's been done, and both sides need to be more careful about the national security reviews. But there is nothing that really can come back to address some of the structural issues in the bilateral relationship that can replace a bilateral investment treaty. China and the United States started negotiating towards the bilateral investment treaty back in 1982. But now nobody bothers even to mention that. Unfortunately, it did not really materialize toward the end of the Obama administration. We should pick that up as a way out of this. Basically, what I'm really trying to say is that there is no logic for the two countries to be so mad at each other. There are serious issues for rethinking on both sides.
Great, that's a great overview, and the big question. Dr. Mann, you started to answer what was, I intended to be my second question, which is, if the trade war were to end, would it actually improve the Chinese economy? Which is another way to ask, is the trade war the cause of the decline in the Chinese economy? So you've answered this a little bit already. Professor Yao, why is the Chinese economy in a downturn? Is it because of the trade war, or is there something else that's the problem?
Well, we can talk about the kind of a more structural change or cyclical change. Structurally, the Chinese economy is slowing down just because the Chinese economy has basically finished industrialization, or finished at the highest point of industrialization. So looking at all the successful economies, after industrialization, you slow down. That's just for sure. Okay, so nothing to do with policy or trade war. But if we think about the cyclical changes in the Chinese economy, I would say that the trade war at least has some psychological effects on the Chinese economy, particularly in the stock market. And this time, when the stock market falls, that has a real impact on the real economy. So many companies are facing bankruptcy because of the drop of the stock market. So in that sense, yes, the trade war has had a real impact on the Chinese economy.
Dr. Lardy, is it the trade war that causes China's downturn at this moment, or are there other factors that are more important?
Well, I certainly think the trade war is part of it for the reason Yao Yang mentioned. There's been a lot of stress in the economy due to the decline in the stock market. I don't think, however, that's directly due to the trade war. The softness or sharp decline in the stock market in China is driven by changes in liquidity. This has always been a liquidity-driven market, and I think the Chinese wisely decided towards the end of 2016 that the leverage in the Chinese economy was too high. There was a huge accumulation of financial risks, and they have steadily slowed the growth of credit. Not only have they slowed the growth of credit, they've channeled more and more of it into the better regulated parts of the financial system to reduce financial risk. Now, this has perhaps unexpectedly, but perhaps predictably, slowed credit to the private sector, which has been in extreme distress. They have had less and less access to credit because they were relying very heavily on the informal sector, the so-called shadow banking system. So I think the main reason for the slowdown is entirely domestic up until now. If you look at trade, for example, in the first 3 quarters of last year, imports were growing at about 20%, exports at about 13%. So at least through the 3rd quarter, I didn't see a big direct effect of the trade war. But in the last couple of months, the numbers have slowed significantly, and there are some people who think they will continue to slow on the trade side as we move through the 1st quarter. So most of the slowdown, I think, is due to the slowdown of credit and also some long-term structural factors, and that is that the state sector has been given increasingly preferential access to credit. It's grossly inefficient, and their productivity has declined by over 50% in the last decade, and the state companies are dragging down China's economic growth as they get more and more credit. So it's a combination of too much emphasis on the state in the last 5 or 6 years, and the deleveraging, which has a positive aspect, which should be noted, but also has a downside, particularly for the private sector. We are in a period now, for example, in which for the first time ever, starting at the beginning of 2017, for the first time ever in the industrial sector, the state sector is growing more rapidly than the private sector. In the previous decade, private companies on average grew twice as fast as state companies. Since the beginning of 2017, state companies have leapt ahead. They're growing much more rapidly than private companies, even though they're much less efficient. So they've gotten a lot of access to credit, and the private sector's previously very robust contribution to China's economic growth has been significantly eroded.
Oh, I want to interrupt you for 1 second. Did they have these? Like, if I wanted to call on them, could they bring these up? These charts that you were going to originally do? That we changed? Do you have them? No? No? All right. Never mind. But you've got some interesting data which shows the huge degree to which loans have now been directed to state-owned enterprises rather than to the private sector. Dr. Mann, anything you wanted to add to what's causing China's woes?
Yeah, I did want to add the observation. I agree very much with Nick that the restriction of credit was an active policy choice in order to delever the economy, to reduce the dependence on fixed investment as a source of growth. But what was not appreciated at the time, and this of course started not bad a year ago anyway, what was not appreciated at the time was the extent to which there would be collateral damage for consumers, for the household sector. Now, I would argue that the equity channel was not the most important channel, that in fact the collateral damage to dampen the household demand was coming from the turnover in housing prices. And that is a major source of wealth, represents a wealth shock. Consumers respond to that with a pulling back of their household spending. The issue about the collateral damage to consumers coming through the restrictions on the extent to which credit was restricted to the private enterprises, that also affected consumers because active employment, firing of people who are in the private sector creates an environment of employment insecurity, which also would affect the desire of households to spend. So the collateral damage to the household sector was well in place before we had this additional round of the trade war. So, I mean, and that's why I worry that sort of quote, quote, resolving the trade side of this will not be enough to really change the trajectory for the Chinese economy. And if that is what happens, then you kind of have to wonder about sort of the consequences of we made a deal, but it didn't work.
That's right.
The last point that I would like to make, though, about sort of collateral damage is we haven't yet talked about the collateral damage to the global economy of the U.S. China trade war. And the collateral damage is both on the real side, meaning through the global value chains to the neighborhood, to Europe through the global value change and the importance of trade with Europe. And then also we have to recognize the collateral damage to the global economy through the sentiment. As in, if these two big guys in the room are fighting it out, just everybody else, the smaller ones, all end up being the negative consequence. And so that is an important ingredient. Of course, that global damage feeds back to worsen the underlying macroeconomic frameworks and underpinnings against which both the U.S. and China are dealing on this big but little trade issue.
Professor Liu.
Yes, several observations. Number one, I think China's economy is slowing down. It's real, So the growth rate and per se is still a decent one. For example, Q3 is still 6.5, but the rate.
You really believe that?
Slowing
You
down.
believe 6.5?
Yeah, more or less. Yeah, I think there's a different opinions even among Chinese colleagues.
Even among this panel, you had to see the reaction to your panelists. They were like,
I'm
startled,
sure
yes.
if you want to go to that statistical details, okay, maybe it's very lengthy and technical. I appreciate there's different opinions. But even you look at the objectively and comprehensively at the official statistics data, actually there's a worrying signs. That is the basic fact. And even you don't challenge the integrity and authenticity of the data, actually it's slower, faster than what we expected. That is the basic fact. Of course, you want to plunge into that detail, it will be complicated.
No need.
Number two, I think, why the reason?
Yes.
Because last year, at the beginning of last year, I think more or less, especially in the policy circles, making circles in China, they sort of the optimism. This is why they push some policy deleveraging even stronger. On the other hand, they reduce the dose of the fiscal stimulus. So I think that contributed to a lot in the cyclical policy perspectives to the slowing down. Another factor I think may be very important, also highlighted by my colleagues already. And is about the and the basic structural factors. Actually, Chinese government in recent years put very high priority to supply side structural reform. They did a lot of work to solve the issue like overcapacity in certain areas, and also was effective. For example, the prices for the steel and other sectors has been going up. But on the other hand, there's some areas like, for example, the market access for the private sector, or the land ownership, and the rights, in the rural area. All these areas, in my personal observation, is crucially important or sensitive to the typing out of the growth potential. I think in these areas, maybe the reform measures has been not as fast as we expected. I think that is very important because if you look at the data, you will see, the investment, especially by the private sector, has been shutting down. On the other hand, we see a lot of the credit growth of the credit spread, especially for the firms, private firms. A lot of the defaults, and for these bonds, issued by the private firms. So I think that is most important, also very important issue. Of course, external environment, the negative change of the external environment also play a role in that. But so far, I think if you look at the data, the export sector is still doing well. Nominal growth rate is still something like 10%, even more than that, and the real growth rate is still something like 5%. So the third point I want to say is, the situation has been well recognized by the academics in China. Also I think realized by the policymakers. You can see clearly, especially in Q4, there's a quite significant, even you can drastic change, in Chinese policy, not only in macroeconomic perspectives, in monetary policy, fiscal policy, even from structural factors. For example, the 1st November, top leader, and held a meeting, personally clarify the official policies towards the private sector, supporting private sector, clarify a lot of issues or thoughts on the society among prospects of private sector, also signal firm policy stance for reform and opening up. Especially just now, we talk about this year's trade war and trade negotiation and deal. I think now, maybe, we're in a very unexpected, how can I say, very unusual point of time. Now, there's both domestic pressures together with external pressures, created sort of environment, maybe, we never know in future, induce, even more profound policy adjustment, even, fundamental reform in this year. Let's hope so. Thank you.
Professor Zhao, you've made clear you're not an economist, so I'm not going to ask you why you think the economy is down, but I will ask you the following question, since you're professor of political science, which I find to be one of the most difficult sciences of all. I think to the man and woman up here on this panel, what they've highlighted about the Chinese economy is that reforms that they thought were going to happen didn't. Maybe there's actually been reversal in reforms. The rise of state involvement. There was a time when I think nearly everyone would have agreed in both countries that there was this inexorable march toward a more market-based economy, a liberalized economy. And that seems to have reversed, let's say, the last 8 or 10 years. Why?
Well, I would say that the notion of state and market, it's much easier to have textbook clarity than, doing it in real policy and in affecting everyday life. One of the difficulties, I would think, in the Chinese economic policy articulation, both domestically and to the outside world, is often it's very easy to go for this rhetorical clarity, like what Dr. Qin Xiao just mentioned, that the market play a decisive role in allocation of resources. That's what most textbooks say. And where is the market? How do you do that? I'm trying to phrase my words. I think the state-owned sector in China has its own sets of unique historical conditions that date way back into the 1920s, 1930s, when the country was weak and feeble. And this whole idea, if you look at the crust of state-owned enterprise, this whole idea that you don't put shareholder profits ahead of everything else, goes back to the time when the country was weak, with under occupation. And in other words, you need to have that almost a revolutionary spirit to put together to get something done. And today, if, for example, when you deal with natural response to disasters, when you think about connecting villages with power lines, which would otherwise villagers would not be able to access, they would have to move their houses. So the state-owned sector is not a villain that you just somehow have to finish up. So that's one thing I would want to say. Another point, there's sometimes the purpose I'm doing this is to try to foster a dialogue. Okay. Now another point is that somehow in the Chinese system, over the years, especially since in the past, should I say, 5 or 8 years, the domestic rhetoric has gone to the exact opposite side, as if the only way to rescue the economy is to do the state-owned sector, to have that monopoly, like to drive out the so-called privately owned sector, including, frankly speaking, foreign sectors. There was that sentiment of jubilance after the stimulus package put together in 2009, the 4 trillion yuan stimulus, and we are stuck with the Japan disease today. Basically, the only thing that seems to work is one stimulus after another that pulls into these roads that go into nowhere. That you build subways or highways where you can never collect the fees back. That's going to be a permanent drag on the Chinese economy. So how do we have a conversation whereby you don't go to the extremes? This is a real challenge. I personally see a lot of good medicine in the free advice that comes from the demand of the White House on the Chinese economy. It may taste bitter. That's what we need to do and intake and try to digest. And the worst thing that could happen to China, or for that matter, to an economy of this size around the world, is for China to go in the wrong direction of scapegoating the slowdown on the United States.
Anybody else want to answer that question as to why have the reforms slowed? And this is a panel about the trade war, and I think a lot of what drives the trade war is that reforms didn't happen as fast as people thought, and therefore is one of the causes of the trade war. Why do you think that Dr. Lardy, why do you think it's either slowed or maybe even gone backward?
Well, I think it's gone backward primarily because of Xi Jinping. From the moment he came into office, he seemed to endorse the third plenum reforms of November of 13, but he kept talking about making state companies bigger. And so that tendency, and then they accelerated a merger program that created larger and larger state companies, huge conglomerates. Sectors where there had been oligopoly power were converted into monopolies. Competition was reduced. The incentive for innovation and cost control disappeared. The opportunities for corruption increased. And the productivity, as reflected in the official data of state companies, went down dramatically. And if it hadn't gone down, if it had continued to, let me preface that by saying, back in 2007, prior to the global financial crisis, the productivity of state and private companies was roughly equal. Today, the productivity of state companies has declined by between 50% and 2/3, and the productivity of private companies did dip down during the global financial crisis, but is now above where it was in 2007. So if the productivity of state companies had not deteriorated, this economy would have been growing 2 percentage points faster than it actually has grown. And so I think one has to recognize when Xi Jinping talks about making state companies bigger, that sends a very important signal to local officials. They don't want to have any reduction in state companies in their jurisdictions. They have forced local banks to dramatically increase support of money-losing companies. He actually says bigger and better, but better is not defined. Better to me means more efficient, more this and more that. And you can see it in the data. The share of lending by city commercial banks has roughly doubled over this period. It's huge now. These are the banks that are under the control of local governments. And local state companies are among the least efficient. So I think, tone at the top matters. I think Xi Jinping is a very powerful leader, and when he talks about making state companies bigger, there's a very positive response down in the localities, which has been quite adverse for China's economic growth. I don't want to say it started completely after the beginning in 2012. There were some things going on even before that time that were not very encouraging, but I think that trend accelerated after Xi Jinping became first party secretary in the fall of 2012.
Other panelists agree, disagree? Dr. Mann?
Well, I am not as knowledgeable about Chinese economies as the other people on this panel, so I can't make reference specifically to Xi, but as a student of the development process that countries have to go through, it is extremely challenging to switch horses of a development strategy. Very few countries, in fact, I cannot think of one that has been able to make the transition from a export-oriented, strongly controlled and organized economy to one that is driven by domestic demand and the private sector. We can even look at the cases of Germany and Japan that have not made the transition from export orientation to domestic demand-led organic growth. So, the bridge that the Chinese had to cross, kind of building it as they go, it's kind of like the U.S. Marines. They build a bridge, and cross it. That's very hard to do in an economy, especially as you give up control and or you sort of say at the top, I want there to be more market orientation, and therefore local authorities have to give up control. That's a very hard plan to reach fulfillment. So could another leader have done a better job at building more pontoons across the bridge that you have to get to? Probably. Would it have had a lot of downside problems? Yeah. So it's a trade-off. It's a trade-off that economies and the policymakers within those economies have to face. And as I say, I can't think of a country that's been able to make the transition.
Professor Liu, I saw you nodding your head.
Yes. So the economists like our age were trained in China.
32?
No. Learned a lot of the Marxism. When the Marxism says when you assess historical event, you need not only, of course, the leader's role is important, but also even more fundamentally important is the driving forces, environment, which influence the leaders as well as the individuals and the behavior. So in that aspect, I think if you look back over 4 decades history of the reform, you will get some lessons that will be useful to understand the current situation. For example, in the 80s and 90s, why the first generation of the leaders want to push reform, vigorously, and just sort of all difficult. Number one, generally speaking, is the mounting pressures. Mounting pressures because the Cultural Revolution, the failure of the planning regime, made sort of the consensus among the elites as well as leaders, the old, how can I say, model doesn't work. Number two, when they, open up, when the leaders travel to outside world, including Singapore and other countries,
Houston, Texas.
There's alternatives. So this is why they vigorously, sorted all these problems. Then in the Zhongji period, you can see there are also pressures. Number one, inflation. Huge inflation, they have to control. In order to control inflation once for all, you need to address all these issues like the soft budget for the SOE, like the physical sort of the discipline issues. So now you need the comprehensive domestic reform package. On the other hand, number two, the external side. You remember in this country, each year you put so-called, most favored nations status review. So make top leaders in China feel very difficult. They need to know in order to address both domestic issues and external problems, especially China and the U.S. relationships, you need bold reform and opening up, measures. But if you compare with these first 20 years experiences, you look at what happened in recent years. Generally speaking, number one, economy is growing very fast, reasonably well. So generate a lot of taxation, fiscal income. So it seems to us, or a lot of people inside China, the economic growth in China can take care of themselves, can spontaneously, perform that kind of way. So in China, there's a joke, if the government have a lot of physical resources, have a lot of money, all the problems will become internal, people's internal problems, rather than, need to be reformed with a painful reform measures. Okay, so this is why I think, number one, all the leaders, they recognize that reform is necessary. I think nobody doubt about that. Number two, even in recent years, I agree. I highlighted already, previously in the previous talk, I say some crucial areas reform has been delayed. I think they should be addressed as a matter of urgency. But on the other hand, you must, if you observe what happened in China, actually there's a lot of reform. Piecemeal reform, marginal reform, especially reform in the areas of creating sort of the social welfare net, to provide certain kind of and the safety nets for the poor peoples. I think would be necessary, but they need to do more. So in other words, I want to emphasize, reiterate what I said before. This year, and last year, we faced totally new situation. Both domestic and external environment change so rapidly in direction to create sort of the mounting pressures, for some kind of the reform. Maybe we haven't seen, for a long time. So that is the interesting, perspectives we can observe what will happen in China this year and next year. Thank you.
Professor Yao, so Dr. Lardy specifically pointed to Xi Jinping. Dr. Mann said, yes, probably that he's an issue, but also it's just wicked hard to go from an industrial-driven economy to a consumer-driven economy. Professor Liu says, you know what, when the economy is growing, it's really easy for politicians to backtrack. We know that here. What do you think is the issue?
Well, okay.
Yeah.
I think all three have spoke out truth, but coming to the reform of SOE, I actually have a different interpretation than Nick, right? So if you look at the data, as you said, up until 2017, the share of SOE actually dropped, right? So it's just a recent SOE share began to increase. I think that was caused by deleveraging. When deleveraging came, SOEs continue to get the credit, and the private companies don't. So that's why SOE share began to increase. If you read Xi Jinping...
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I feel like you've just proved Dr. Lardy's point, actually, that the rise of the state has been allowed to just increase dramatically, right, in the allocation of credit.
Yeah, but that's not an issue of institutional change. It's just a policy change, right? It's just a bad policy to me. I think deleveraging has been too fast. That's a policy mistake. In terms of institution, I don't think that the institution has changed that much. Even when you read Xi Jinping's own speech, he emphasized both SOE, but also private sector growth. So from that, I believe that you have spoken some truth about how much we can attribute to just one person. I think it's still debated.
Okay. One of the great skills you have to master as a political leader in China is that you speak in such a way that's sufficiently vague for all different sides to see that you are wise.
That's true here, I think.
Well, I don't want to name a specific leader. Successive leaders in China try to outperform each other in that way. But as I see it, as a scholar, I think the sentiment towards supporting a large state-owned sector sort of began way before President Mr. Xi became president. Even before before the Wall Street crisis, along with the talk of the rise of China, you have lot of reminder among the academic elites in policy discussion circles, reminder of China of a middle income trap. And the reference point would usually be Latin America. When the Latin America of the 50s and 60s, that tends to lend support to the idea that you cannot globalize as thoroughly like that. Frankly speaking, anti-globalization is not just an American phenomenon. It has been as American in China, maybe in a very salient way, much stronger way. So the Chinese dichotomy is 强 versus 大, right? Big versus strong. So in other words, as the overall size of the economy was growing, there was a lot of recognition that China actually has many areas of weakness. So that's one point. That's where the Latin American experience started building. And then the Wall Street crisis in 2008. Unfortunately, I think the mainstream intellectual in China, maybe except most of us on this panel, coming here, who are educated in the States, literally, many in China literally looked at the 2008 Wall Street problem as an irreversible decline of capitalism, or all the ideas that go with free market competition. And that lends support to the idea of state-owned sector as well. But that's a mistake, frankly speaking. A third element of the social background for this is, as these indigenous Chinese companies started to grow up from playing literally supportive roles by doing export processing, by just piecing components together that are shipped inside, or subcontracting, as they grow up to be able to compete, to be able to get contracts rather than just be the subcontractor, they started to realize that indeed, standards, indeed, size matters, indeed, national security, however you invoke it, it matters. I myself actually recall an episode before we had Wi-Fi as the standards for wireless communication. There was a Chinese campaign to get a Chinese standard to be established as a global standard called WAPI, W-A-P-I. Nick Lardy and others more familiar about that case. So those kind of developments, the Chinese lost, started to somehow feed into this sentiment that, maybe, with some governmental support, a state-owned sector is not a bad idea. So the last point is that in the context of why are we talking about this, we're not, going back to my own idea, is that the decoupling talk that's ongoing in the United States is a bad message, in the sense that it actually helps to drive those in China that have been arguing, one way to be quote unquote strong is to make use of sovereign power of government, to be protective and to be strong rather than just inflated big by number, right? You have strengths and core technology at the core, including market entry requirements. So we cannot decouple the economy. We cannot decouple from each other in terms of standards. We should learn how to compete more. We should compete on the basis of treaties and rather than just specific projects.
I'm going to open it up to the floor for questions. As we move a microphone down to that gentleman who got his hands up first, remember, say your name first, who you're with. And I'm going to ask a question as that microphone moves towards the gentleman with the glasses who has the blue shirt on. I'm not sure any of you are going to answer this, but China's cut tariffs, lifted JV requirements. You've highlighted a number of the reforms that have happened in the last year. Do any of you think President Trump's tactics are working to change China's behavior?
Well, I certainly think the answer has to be to some extent yes. I think a lot of these things, of course, are in China's own interest. They've been cutting tariffs since the mid-1990s. a lot of unilateral tariff cuts before they got into the WTO. Then we had a long period where they didn't cut tariffs. Now we're back to tariff cutting. It increases competition, and that will be good for the economy in the long run. So some of it is in self-interest. Some of it clearly must be in response to external pressure. I would say, as I alluded to earlier, that they don't seem to be getting too much credit for the steps that they've taken. They've been barely noticed in the administration.
The one thing that I would add to that is that sort of in the olden days of WTO multilateral trade negotiations, it was getting the benefits of trade by reaching agreements with other countries was supportive of opening up and sort of being, well, I'm doing this because I'm part of this WTO negotiation. I didn't have to say it was good for me too. I just sort of said I was using the external pressure in order to get the domestic reforms that if I just asked for them as domestic reforms, I'd never get anywhere. So what has happened in the most recent, basically last maybe 20 years of trade negotiations is the shoe is on the other foot. It's the foreign pressure to do domestic reforms has a negative snapback effect. And if anything, you want to say, I'm doing it for myself, and, well, if it's fine for the foreigners, well, that's okay too.
Gentleman who has the mic. What's your name? Who are you with? What's your question?
Jasper Yang with Columbia University.
A student or a professor?
Neither. Research. Really want to be a professor, but thank you for the opportunity, for your insights, sharing with us. Question, do you think there is some level of misjudgment from the top level decision makers in China about the trade war, especially about the, say, intensity and the intention of such trade war? And what do you think the reasons is, and what advice would you give to the policymakers to do better, to improve in reacting to the truth?
Misjudgment in what sense? About their ability to win, their political motive? What do you mean?
One of the things that they try to synthesize in terms of consensus is what they would say, 小打小赢,大打大赢, basically meaning the winning that China would gain correlates positively on how aggressively we, react, on how aggressively we fight. And another judgment that I've heard is that this is just a campaign that President Trump and the Republicans try to wage to win midterm. So everything will subside after midterm, which doesn't seem to be the case. Things like these that circulate on media.
Okay,
yeah.
Got it.
Thank you.
Oh, what's jump ball?
I don't want to use the word misjudgment. I mean, has been a learning process, right? It is many of the measures the Chinese government has adopted over the last year worked before, right? Like China bought more products from the United States, did a little bit, right? Then the U.S. said, oh, okay, that's fine. So that, everyone lives in his or her own experience. And that's the same for Chinese leaders. So that's, I think that's my interpretation, how things have happened in China. But I think by the time of September, October last year, the Chinese government has changed their mind. So in that sense, as Nick said, so the trade war became kind of real in that sense. Right? So the Chinese government now is paying a lot of attention to resolving this dispute.
Well, if you judge by action, not just by the rhetoric, back in July 2017 at the Hansburg G20 in Germany, the Chinese government tabled a plan to reduce steel production domestically and reduce exports of steel. There was a target. This was sort of what Catherine was saying, using quote-unquote foreign pressure to stimulate, speed up domestic reform or to reduce resistance domestically. it's that offer tabled in Germany was by nature voluntary export restraint. Frankly speaking, this was taking a page from the trade negotiation between Japan and the Reagan administration. But like Yao Yang said, by September, when the same plan was tabled in Washington, D.C., the whole meeting lasted less than an hour. Then very soon, there was a trade, there was steel and aluminum tariffs, and not just from China, from the rest of the world. What I'm really trying to say is that I don't think there was a misjudgment or anything. I also, frankly speaking, this is not the time to sound triumphant, to somehow come out saying, well, I have my head high or low, or which party, whether the Washington or Beijing, has prevailed or not. As Yao Yang said, both governments go through a learning process. And should I say, for the U.S. government, whether it's Mr. Trump or anything else, you have a question to answer, not just from China, but from the rest of the world as well. What can work for you? What can satisfy you? Is there anything, or is it you that, and on the part of China as well, why it's so difficult for you to take some actions and get it over with?
Anybody over here have a question? Right here. So every second you talk is less answer that you get, so go ahead. The microphone is right there. What's your name?
My name is Wei Jungu. I'm a consultant to Minjin Group, the internet media group based in Long Island. I got asked by President Carter when I worked for the Chinese Foreign Ministry during his first visit to China, has the incidence of premarital sex and extramarital sex among the Chinese people increased after the establishment of Sino-US relations? And I could not answer. I was very junior at that time. But I want to ask our Chinese colleagues in the panel, has the general level of freedom increased for the Chinese people in general and for Chinese scholars in particular since Trump started fighting the tariff war?
That's a segue. But ultimately, a very interesting question, the level of freedom for academics, etc., in China in the wake of the trade war?
I think, I don't think the trade war, I also asked my American colleagues, right? The trade war was not illicit because of political reason, it's purely economic. So in that sense, I don't think that the trade war has anything to do with freedom whatsoever in China. It's just purely economics.
Anybody else? We're out of time, so if you're not dying to answer, don't feel.
Well, the freedom and premarital sex, they're both very difficult to define or quantify.
I think they're observed in the breach, right? Dr. Mann, last word.
So the comment that I would make is that there have been constraints put on people, on different sources of data. As the economic situation has deteriorated, the reporting of data has also deteriorated, and one can wonder if there's a correlation between those two.
This has been great. Thank you so much. I'm always honored to be asked to do this because it's always so illuminating, and you guys were great today. I really appreciate it. Now on to the next item on the agenda. It's a break, right? We're taking a break.